The conference room fell silent as Colonel Hayes demanded her call sign, his tone dripping with mockery. "What do they call you, Lieutenant? Sparrow? Pixie?" The room erupted in laughter. Irene Hill stood there, her jaw tight, knowing what was coming next. When she finally spoke those two words, Phantom Queen, the colonel's coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Phantom Queen wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend, a ghost story whispered in enemy communications. And the 2-3-year-old woman standing before him had earned it in ways that would haunt his nightmares. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line at Naval Air Station Oceana as Irene Hill completed her pre-flight checklist for the third time that week. Not because she was flying, she wasn't, but because reviewing procedures for aircraft she'd never be assigned to pilot had become her ritual of quiet rebellion. At 23, Irene had graduated top of her class at the Naval Academy, aced every tactical assessment, and somehow still found herself relegated to administrative duties while male pilots half as qualified flew combat missions. Her European accent, a melodic blend of her Romanian mother and Italian father, made her stand out in ways she'd learned to resent. Combined with her petite frame and expressive features that betrayed every emotion, she'd become the unit's unofficial mascot rather than a respected aviator. Still playing pretend Hill, Lieutenant Commander Brennan's voice cut through the morning air as he walked past, his flight suit crisp and his swagger insufferable. He was headed to the flight briefing for Operation Distant Thunder, a multinational training exercise that Irene had helped design but wouldn't participate in. She bit back the response burning on her tongue. 6 months at Oceana had taught her that confrontation only reinforced their perception of her as too emotional for combat aviation. Instead, she offered a tight smile and returned to her checklist, her pen gripping so hard it left impressions on her palm. The administrative office where Irene spent her days was a converted hangar space that smelled of jet fuel and disappointment. Her desk sat in the corner, surrounded by filing cabinets containing maintenance records, flight logs, and personnel files. She'd memorized most of them during the endless hours of data entry and report generation. Commander Patricia Vance, the only other woman in the squadron's leadership, found Irene reorganizing the supply requisition forms by aircraft type rather than date. "You know, that's not how Grayson wants them filed," Vance said, her tone more weary than critical. "Grayson's system is inefficient," Irene replied, her accent thickening as it always did when she was frustrated. "Cross-referencing by aircraft type reduces search time by 40%. I ran the numbers. I'm sure you did." Vance perched on the edge of Irene's desk. "But running numbers isn't going to get you in a cockpit, Hill. You need to play the game." "What game?" Irene's dark eyes flashed. "The one where I pretend to be less competent so they feel comfortable? The one where I laugh at their jokes about women pilots and smile when they call me sweetheart during briefings?" Vance's expression softened with recognition of a battle she'd fought years ago. "The one where you pick your moments to prove them wrong. You're brilliant, Irene. Everyone knows it. But brilliance threatening when it comes in a package they don't expect." After Vance left, Irene pulled out a folder she kept hidden beneath her regulation manuals. Inside were printouts of tactical scenarios, flight patterns, and combat simulations she'd been working on for months. Not official assignments, just her own obsessive preparation for opportunities that never came. The breakthrough had happened 3 weeks ago during a late-night shift. Irene had been reviewing classified mission reports when she noticed a pattern in enemy radar coverage that everyone else had missed. There was a gap, a brief window of vulnerability that could be exploited, but only by a pilot with exceptional precision and nerve. She'd written up her findings and submitted them through proper channels. The response had been a form letter thanking her for her input and assuring her that experienced personnel would handle tactical analysis. 2 days later, she'd overheard Brennan presenting her exact strategy in a briefing. claiming it as his own insight. When she'd confronted him, he'd laughed. "Come on, Hill. You really think the brass is going to listen to the admin girl about combat tactics?" That night, Irene had made a decision. If the system wouldn't recognize her capabilities through official channels, she'd find another way. The Naval Air Station had a flight simulator that ran 24/7, used primarily for training and evaluation. Irene had discovered that between 0200 and 0400, it sat unused, the overnight security staff too bored to notice or care who entered the building. She'd been using those hours to log simulator time, running increasingly complex scenarios, pushing herself beyond any standard training protocol. She wasn't just practicing, she was preparing. The scenarios she ran weren't from the standard training database. Irene had created custom missions based on real-world intelligence, combining terrain data, weather patterns, and enemy capabilities to build the most challenging situations possible. She flew blind approaches, combat intercepts, and emergency procedures until her responses became instinctive. On this particular morning, as she filed requisition forms and answered emails, Irene's mind was elsewhere, replaying her simulator session from the previous night. She'd successfully navigated a scenario involving multiple hostile aircraft, adverse weather, and a mechanical failure, all while maintaining mission parameters. The simulator had rated her performance as exceptional, but the only witness was the empty room and the ghost of her own ambition. "Hill," Captain Grayson's voice boomed across the office. "Conference room, now. And bring the personnel files for the Distant Thunder deployment." Irene grabbed the requested files and hurried to the conference room, her heart sinking as she recognized what this meant. They were finalizing the roster for the exercise, the official confirmation of who was essential enough to fly and who wasn't. The conference room was already crowded when she arrived. Pilots and weapons systems officers filled the chairs while support personnel lined the walls. Irene found a spot near the door, clutching her files like a shield against the inevitable disappointment. Commander Grayson stood at the front, his weathered face serious as he reviewed the deployment roster. "Gentlemen and ladies," he added with a perfunctory nod toward Irene and one other female officer. "Operation Distant Thunder kicks off in 72 hours. This is our chance to demonstrate our capabilities alongside our NATO allies and show the world what American naval aviation can do." As Grayson read through the assignments, Irene felt each name like a small cut. Brennan would lead the primary strike package. Davison would fly reconnaissance. Even Lieutenant Morrison, who'd washed out of advanced training twice before, barely passing on his third attempt, had a slot in the support element. "Hill," Grayson's voice cut through her thoughts. "You're on logistics coordination. I need you to ensure all equipment manifests are accurate and all support materials are properly distributed." Equipment manifests. Again. Irene nodded mechanically, her expression carefully neutral, even as something cold and hard settled in her chest. Around her, the selected pilots exchanged congratulatory glances and fist bumps, their excitement palpable. As the briefing concluded, Irene gathered her files and turned to leave, but Colonel Hayes' arrival stopped everyone in their tracks. Hayes was visiting from Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort, ostensibly to observe the joint exercises, but really to evaluate whether the Navy pilots were up to Marine standards. "Before you disperse," Hayes announced, his South Carolina drawl filling the room, "I want to address something I've noticed in my review of your personnel files." His eyes scanned the room, landing on Irene with uncomfortable intensity. "I see we have pilots here without combat experience being given significant responsibilities." The implication was clear even if he didn't name names. Irene felt every eye in the room turn toward her. "Now, I understand the Navy has different standards," Hayes continued, his tone suggesting those standards were inferior. "But in the Marines, we believe that combat aviation requires a certain temperament, physical capability. The ability to handle pressure without becoming emotional. Irene's hands clenched around her files, her knuckles white. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but Vance's earlier words echoed in her mind. Pick your moments. This wasn't her moment. Not yet. But as she walked out of the conference room, past the smirking faces and whispered comments, Irene Hill made a promise to herself. She would find her moment, and when she did, they would all remember the name they'd been so eager to dismiss. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation and bureaucracy. Irene processed equipment manifests, coordinated supply shipments, and managed logistics for an operation she wasn't allowed to participate in. Each form she filed, each checklist she completed, felt like another nail in the coffin of her aviation career. But while her days were consumed with administrative duties, her nights belonged to the simulator. Irene had progressed beyond standard training scenarios to something far more ambitious. She'd hacked into the classified mission database, not to steal secrets, but to access real-world tactical data. The scenarios she now flew were reconstructions of actual combat missions, some so classified that even discussing them outside secure facilities could mean court-martial. She knew she was crossing lines, bending rules that could break her career if discovered. But what career? The one where she filed paperwork while less qualified pilots flew missions? The one where her expertise was either ignored or stolen? She'd already been pushed to the margins. What did she have to lose? On the second night, Irene ran a simulation based on a recent incident in the Persian Gulf, where a reconnaissance aircraft had encountered multiple hostile fighters. The official after-action report praised the pilot's decision to disengage and return to base. Irene disagreed. She'd studied the radar, tracks, analyzed the enemy flight patterns, and identified 3 separate opportunities where an aggressive countermaneuver could have turned defensive retreat into tactical advantage. She flew the scenario 5 times, refining her approach each iteration. By the final run, she not only survived the encounter but had simulated successfully marking all hostile aircraft for follow-on strikes while suffering 0 damage to her own aircraft. The simulator's AI, designed to be nearly unbeatable in such scenarios, had been outmaneuvered completely. As Irene climbed out of the simulator at 0345, her flight suit soaked with sweat and her hands trembling from adrenaline, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Pure, unfiltered joy. This was who she was meant to be. Not the woman who filed reports and managed supply chains, but the pilot who could see patterns others missed, who could execute maneuvers others wouldn't attempt. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Commander Vance found Irene in the admin office, her expression troubled. "We have a problem with the distant Thunder deployment. Lieutenant Morrison failed his final medical clearance. Inner ear issue that makes him unsuitable for flight status." Irene looked up from her computer, calculating the implications. Morrison had been assigned to the support package, flying close air support scenarios. His absence would create a gap in the roster. Do we have a replacement pilot available? That's the issue. Everyone qualified is already assigned. Grayson's considering pulling someone from the primary package, which would weaken our overall capability. Vance paused meaningfully. Unless we had someone else who could step in. Someone who's technically qualified even if they haven't been flying operationally. Hope flared in Irene's chest before reality crushed it. You know they won't assign me. Hayes is already questioning my presence here. Grayson won't risk the political optics. Maybe not, but the regulations are clear. We need a qualified pilot, and you're qualified. Vance leaned closer, lowering her voice. I'm going to recommend you for the slot. What Grayson does with that recommendation is up to him, but at least it will be on record that the option was available. 2 hours later, Irene sat outside Grayson's office, her personnel file in hand, waiting to learn her fate. Through the closed door, she could hear raised voices. Grayson and someone else, their words muffled but their tone unmistakable, were arguing. When the door finally opened, Colonel Hayes emerged, his face flushed with anger. He glanced at Irene with barely concealed contempt before stalking down the hallway. Grayson appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted. "Hill, get in here." Inside the office, Grayson sat heavily behind his desk and gestured for Irene to take a seat. "Commander Vance has recommended you as Morrison's replacement for Distant Thunder. She seems to think you're up to the task." "I am, sir," Irene said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've maintained my flight qualifications. I know the mission parameters. I can do this." "I'm sure you believe that." Grayson rubbed his temples. "But belief and capability aren't the same thing. You haven't flown operationally in 6 months, Hill. You've been doing admin work." "Because that's where I was assigned, sir. Not because of any deficiency in my abilities. Colonel Hayes believes otherwise. He thinks putting you in a cockpit for a high-profile exercise would be a mistake that could embarrass the entire Navy." Grayson met her eyes. He used the word liability. The word hit Irene like a physical blow. Liability. Not inexperienced. Not undertrained. Liability. The implication was clear. Her presence would make things worse, would endanger others, would be a problem that needed to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. "Sir," Irene began, her accent thickening with emotion, "I have never been a flyer. Liability. Every assessment, every evaluation, every metric by which pilots are judged, I have exceeded standards. The only thing I haven't been given is the opportunity to prove it operationally." "And whose fault is that?" Grayson's question wasn't accusatory, just tired. "You think I don't see what's happening here? You think I don't know that you're as good or better than half the pilots I've got flying? But this isn't about what I think. It's about what works within the system we have." "Then change the system, sir." "I can't. Not by myself. Not fast enough to help you," he sighed. "I'm denying Vance's recommendation. Morrison's slot will remain empty and will adjust the mission parameters accordingly. You'll continue your current duties." Irene stood, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. "Is that all, sir?" "No." Grayson's voice softened slightly. "For what it's worth, Hill, I'm sorry, you're getting a raw deal. But sometimes being a good officer means accepting situations you can't change and finding other ways to contribute." As Irene walked out of the office, she realized something fundamental had broken inside her. Not her spirit or her determination, but her faith in the system she'd sworn to serve. She'd followed the rules, trusted in meritocracy, believed that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. She'd been wrong. CTA. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. That afternoon, Irene requested leave, citing personal matters. Grayson approved it without question, probably relieved to have her out of sight during the exercise. She packed a small bag and drove 3 hours north to a civilian airfield she discovered during her first month at Oceana. The airfield catered to recreational pilots and offered rental time in small aircraft for qualified flyers. Irene had been coming here on her days off, using her personal funds to log flight hours in anything she could afford. Cessnas, Pipers, even an aging T-28 Trojan that the owner let her fly in exchange for help with maintenance. Today, she rented a Cessna 172 and filed a flight plan for a simple coastal route. But once she was airborne, Irene deviated from her plan, pushing the small aircraft through maneuvers it wasn't designed for. She flew low over the water, practiced emergency procedures, and tested every limit of the aircraft's performance envelope. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was exactly what she needed. As the sun set over the Atlantic, Irene finally turned the Cessna back toward the airfield, her mind clearer than it had been in months. She'd been trying to prove herself within a system that didn't want to recognize her. She'd been waiting for permission that would never come, seeking validation from people who had already decided she wasn't worthy. No more. If the system wouldn't give her opportunities, she'd create her own. If they wouldn't recognize her capabilities through official channels, she'd demonstrate them in ways they couldn't ignore. Landing the Cessna as darkness fell, Irene Hill made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to wait anymore. She wasn't going to play by rules designed to keep her grounded. Operation Distant Thunder was scheduled to begin in 24 hours. The participants were all assigned, the missions all planned, the expectations all set. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have predicted, was that the exercise was about to get a participant they never expected. And by the time it was over, the name Irene Hill would mean something very different than it did today. The only question was whether she'd survive what came next. Operation Distant Thunder officially commenced at 0600 hours, with a coordination briefing that Irene attended via video link from the logistics center. She watched on screen as Colonel Hayes addressed the assembled pilots, his chest decorated with ribbons that spoke of decades of combat experience. "This exercise will test your limits," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned his reputation in actual combat. "Our allied forces will be running realistic threat scenarios. Multiple bogeys, electronic warfare, adverse conditions. If you can't handle pressure here, you sure as hell won't handle it when bullets are real." Irene watched Brennan and the other pilots nodding seriously, their expressions mixing confidence with appropriate gravity. They looked like warriors preparing for battle. She looked down at her desk, covered in supply requisitions, and felt the familiar burn of resentment. The morning passed slowly as Irene monitored communications channels and updated status reports. The primary strike package launched at 0830, followed by reconnaissance and support elements at staggered intervals. She tracked their progress on the logistics network, watching as blue friendly icons moved across the tactical display toward their designated training areas. At 1,120 hours, the first anomaly occurred. Irene noticed it before anyone else because she'd been studying the radar feeds with the intensity of someone starving for any connection to actual operations. An unidentified aircraft had appeared on the edge of the exercise area, its transponder broadcasting civilian codes, but its flight profile decidedly non-civilian. She immediately flagged it to the Tactical Operations Center. "TOC, this is logistics. I'm showing an unknown contact bearing 270 at 60 miles. Profile doesn't match any civilian traffic patterns." The response came back dismissive. "Logistics, TOC, we've got it. Probably just a recreational pilot who wandered into the exercise area. We'll have air traffic control redirect them." But Irene kept watching, and what she saw made her pulse quicken. The aircraft wasn't wandering randomly. Its course corrections were too precise, its altitude changes too deliberate. Someone was testing the exercise perimeter, probing for gaps in coverage. She ran the aircraft's flight profile through pattern recognition software, comparing it against known reconnaissance techniques. The match was unmistakable. This wasn't a lost civilian. This was a professional intelligence gathering operation, likely a foreign power taking advantage of the exercise to test American response protocols. Irene picked up her phone and called the TOC directly. "This is Lieutenant Hill. That unknown contact is conducting systematic reconnaissance. Pattern matches Soviet-era intelligence gathering protocols. Whoever's flying that aircraft is mapping our exercise coverage. Hill, we appreciate your concern, but we have tactical officers handling threat assessment. Please stick to your assigned duties." The line went dead. Irene stared at her screen, watching the unknown aircraft continue its carefully calculated path. They weren't taking it seriously. They thought she was an over-eager admin officer trying to play analyst. She pulled up the exercise communications protocols and found the frequency being used by the airborne controller, the officer managing all aircraft movements during the exercise. Technically, she wasn't authorized to monitor tactical frequencies. But technically, she wasn't supposed to be ignored when reporting legitimate security concerns either. The tactical situation developed rapidly over the next hour. The strike package engaged simulated enemy forces while the unknown aircraft maintained its patient reconnaissance orbit. Irene watched both situations simultaneously, her mind processing patterns and possibilities that the tactical officers, focused on managing the exercise, weren't seeing. At 1,247 hours, everything changed. The unknown aircraft suddenly broke from its reconnaissance pattern and accelerated directly toward the exercise area. Simultaneously, 2 additional radar contacts appeared from different vectors, all 3 aircraft converging on the position where the Navy strike package was operating. Irene's hands flew across her keyboard, pulling up identification databases and threat assessment protocols. What she found made her blood run cold. The flight profiles matched known aggressor tactics, the kind used by nations that wanted to test American defenses without technically violating international law. They were going to penetrate the exercise area, possibly even simulate attacks on American aircraft, creating an international incident that would embarrass the Navy and undermine confidence in American air defense. She grabbed her phone again, this time calling directly to Commander Vance. "Ma'am, we have a developing situation. 3 aircraft converging on the exercise area with profiles matching hostile intent. This isn't random, it's a coordinated probe." Vance's response was immediate and serious. "What's TOC saying?" "They're not taking it seriously. They think I'm overreacting." There was a pause. Then Vance said something that changed everything. "Hill, how confident are you in this assessment?" "Completely confident, ma'am. This is a textbook aggressor approach. They're going to penetrate our exercise and make us look incompetent. Then we need someone up there who can respond. Someone who sees what you're seeing." Another pause. "There's a reserve aircraft on standby. Maintenance test flight, supposedly. But it's fueled and armed for training scenarios." Irene's heart hammered against her ribs. "Ma'am, are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Lieutenant. I'm telling you that we have a potential situation and limited options. What you do with that information is your decision. But if someone were to take that aircraft and address this threat, I would consider it initiative rather than insubordination." The line went dead. Irene sat frozen for 5 seconds that felt like hours. Then she moved. The reserve FA-18 Super Hornet sat on the auxiliary flight line, its canopy open and its systems already running through automated pre-flight checks. Maintenance Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan stood beside it with a clipboard, looking bored with his routine. Irene approached in her flight suit, helmet bag slung over her shoulder, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Chief, I'm here for the maintenance test flight." Commander Vance signed off on it. Sullivan looked up, surprised. "Nobody told me about any test flight. And since when does Lieutenant Hill fly test hops?" "Since we're short pilots and this bird needs a functional check before tomorrow's missions." Irene pulled out her phone, showing him a text message she'd fabricated during her 30-second walk from the logistics center. It appeared to be from Vance, authorizing the flight. "Check with the TOC if you want, but they're kind of busy right now with the exercise." The chief hesitated, caught between protocol and the reality that everything Irene said sounded plausible. The aircraft did need a post-maintenance check. They were short on pilots. And checking with the TOC during active operations would probably just get him yelled at for bothering them with administrative questions. "Fine," he said finally, "but keep it simple. Basic systems check, nothing fancy. And stay clear of the exercise area." "Understood, Chief." Irene climbed the ladder to the cockpit, her heart racing so hard she was certain he could hear it. She settled into the ejection seat, the familiar embrace of the cockpit feeling like coming home after years of exile. Her hands moved through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have faltered, engines responding normally, avionics online, weapon systems in training mode but functionally operational. She was sitting in $60 million of American air superiority, technology, and she was about to use it without authorization. "Tower, Hornet 649er, requesting taxi for maintenance test flight." 649er. Tower. Taxi to runway 2-8. Maintain VFR, stay below 5,000 feet, and remain clear of the exercise area. 649er copies. Taxi 2-8, VFR below 5,000, clear of exercise area. The Super Hornet rolled forward, its twin engines producing the distinctive whine that made Irene's pulse quicken. She'd flown this aircraft type before, logged dozens of hours during training, but always with instructors or under controlled conditions. Never solo, never in a situation where she was simultaneously the pilot and the mission commander. As she lined up on the runway, Irene keyed her radio to the tower frequency one last time. Tower, 649er ready for departure. 649er, winds 270 at 12, cleared for takeoff. The takeoff roll was smooth, the Hornet accelerating with the eager power of a machine built for combat. Irene rotated at precisely the right speed, feeling the aircraft leap into the air like it had been waiting for this moment as long as she had. Gear up, flaps up, climbing through 1,000 feet with the Virginia coastline spreading out below her. She maintained the assigned altitude and heading for exactly 2 minutes, long enough for Tower to stop paying attention to her radar return. Then she banked hard left, dropped to 200 feet above the ocean, and accelerated toward the exercise area at 500 knots. The tactical frequency crackled with traffic as she switched from Tower to the exercise controller. All players, be advised we have unidentified contacts penetrating the exercise area from multiple vectors. Strike package, continue your scenario. We're vectoring fighters to intercept the unknowns. But Irene had been tracking those unknowns for the past hour. She knew their positions, their likely intentions, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. While the authorized fighters scrambled to respond, she was already perfectly positioned. She armed her training weapons, the simulated missiles that could electronically kill other aircraft without actually firing ordnance. In a real combat scenario, she'd be carrying live weapons. Today, she'd be satisfied with proving a point. The first unknown aircraft appeared on her radar at 40 miles, exactly where Irene had calculated it would be. She adjusted her course slightly, staying low to avoid radar detection, using terrain masking and the ocean's radar clutter to remain invisible. At 20 miles, she acquired the target visually. A fighter-type aircraft, definitely military despite its civilian transponder codes. It was conducting aggressive maneuvers near the Navy strike package, simulating attack runs that would make excellent propaganda if photographed. Irene armed her simulated AIM-120 AMRAAM and waited for the perfect firing solution. The targeting, computer chirped confirmation. She pressed the trigger. Fox 3, she called, announcing the simulated missile launch. Unknown aircraft bearing 090. You are engaged. Training kill. The exercise frequency exploded with confused chatter. Who called that shot? Identify yourself. But Irene was already moving to the second target, her radar showing another unknown aircraft trying to bracket the Navy formation from a different angle. She maneuvered aggressively, putting her Hornet into a position that should have been impossible given where the Navy fighters were supposed to be. Fox 3, second unknown, bearing 275. Training kill. Unidentified Hornet. You are not authorized in this area. Identify immediately. Irene ignored the demands, focused entirely on the tactical situation. The third unknown aircraft had broken off, recognizing that whatever advantage they'd hoped to gain was gone. She pursued briefly, establishing that she could have engaged it as well, then pulled up and climbed to 10,000 feet. Only then did she respond to the increasingly frantic calls for identification. Her voice was calm, professional, utterly devoid of the emotion they would have expected from her. Exercise control. This is Phantom Queen. 3 unknown aircraft engaged and neutralized. Exercise area is secure. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. The radio silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but it felt eternal. Then Colonel Hayes's voice cut through, sharp as broken glass. Phantom Queen, identify yourself immediately. Who authorized your presence in this exercise? Irene took a breath, knowing that her next words would either validate everything she'd done or end her career permanently. Colonel, this is Lieutenant Irene Hill. I was monitoring tactical feeds from logistics when I identified the threat. I took initiative to address a developing situation that could have compromised the exercise. You took initiative? Hayes's voice rose with incredulity. You violated direct orders, launched an unauthorized flight, and interfered with a multinational training exercise? Return to base immediately. We'll discuss your court-martial when you land. With respect, sir, I prevented what would have been a significant intelligence compromise and potential international incident. Those aircraft were conducting hostile reconnaissance with likely intent to penetrate and photograph our forces. That's not your determination to make, Lieutenant. You're a logistics officer, not a tactical commander. Irene's jaw tightened. I'm also the only person who recognized the threat pattern and was positioned to respond. Sir, all aircraft, this is exercise control. A new voice interjected, Commander Vance taking over the frequency. Phantom Queen, you are directed to proceed to holding pattern Alpha and maintain position while we assess the situation. All other aircraft, continue exercise protocols. As Irene maneuvered to lift the designated holding area, her mind raced through possible outcomes. Best case, they'd recognize that she'd correctly identified a real threat and acted appropriately. Worst case, they'd make an example of her for insubordination, regardless of whether her actions had been justified. She circled at 10,000 feet for 23 minutes, watching on her tactical display as the exercise concluded and aircraft began returning to base. The unknown contacts had vanished from radar, their mission disrupted by her intervention. Finally, Vance's voice returned. Phantom Queen, you are cleared to return to base. Approach will be monitoring. Make a straight-in approach to runway 2-8 and taxi directly to the maintenance hangar. Do not, I repeat, do not proceed to the main flight line. Phantom Queen copies. Straight in 2-8, taxi to maintenance hangar. The landing was textbook perfect, muscle memory and hundreds of simulator hours translating into precisely controlled flight. Irene touched down exactly on the 1,000-foot markers, deployed her drag chute at the optimal moment, and taxied with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. But as she approached the maintenance hangar, she saw the reception committee waiting for her. Colonel Hayes stood front and center, his face red even from this distance. Commander Grayson was beside him, looking exhausted. Commander Vance stood slightly apart, her expression carefully neutral. Behind them, at least a dozen other officers and enlisted personnel had gathered, drawn by news of the unauthorized flight. Irene shut down the Hornet's engines and went through the post-flight checklist with meticulous care. Every procedure followed exactly, every switch in its proper position. When ground crew brought the ladder, she climbed down with her helmet under her arm, her spine straight and her chin up. Colonel Hayes met her at the base of the ladder. Lieutenant Hill, you are under arrest, pending investigation for unauthorized use of military aircraft, violation of direct orders, and interference with official operations. You will surrender your credentials and proceed immediately to the base commander's office. Sir, before you proceed with charges, I respectfully request that you review the intelligence data I compiled on those unknown aircraft. I believe you'll find I don't care what data you compiled. Hayes exploded. You're a lieutenant, a logistics officer. You don't get to decide when to take a $60 million aircraft for an unauthorized joyride because you think you've identified a threat. It wasn't a joyride, sir. It was a tactical response to, it was insubordination. Hayes stepped closer, using his height to intimidate. You know what your problem is, Hill? You think being smart makes up for lacking discipline. You think your little European sensibilities give you permission to question orders. Well, this is the United States Marine Corps and Navy, and here we follow orders. Something snapped inside Irene. 6 months of dismissal, of having her capabilities questioned and her contributions stolen, of being treated as furniture that occasionally filed reports, it all crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. "You're right, sir," she said quietly. "I did violate orders. I took an aircraft without authorization. I interfered with your exercise." She paused, meeting his eyes without flinching. "And I saved it from becoming an international embarrassment. Those aircraft were gathering intelligence on our tactics, our communications protocols, our response times. They would have penetrated the exercise area and photographed our forces engaging simulated threats. The intelligence value alone would have been significant. The propaganda value would have been devastating." "That's speculation," Hayes snapped. "No, sir. It's analysis based on pattern recognition and tactical assessment. Skills I developed because I knew that someday I'd need them, even if nobody thought I was worth training properly." Irene's accent thickened with emotion, but her voice remained steady. "You want to court-martial me? Fine. But first, pull the radar tapes. Review the flight profiles of those unknown aircraft. Check with NORAD and see if they flagged them as potential threats. Then tell me I was wrong." Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but Commander Grayson held up a hand. "Colonel, perhaps we should review the evidence before proceeding." "Lieutenant Hill, you're confined to quarters pending investigation. Dismissed." As Irene walked away, she heard Hayes say to Grayson, "I don't care what the evidence shows. She violated orders. She needs to be made an example of." "Maybe," Grayson replied quietly, "or maybe we need to examine why our logistics officer saw a threat that our tactical officers missed." The BOQ room felt smaller than usual as Irene sat on her bunk, still in her flight suit, waiting for the inevitable knock on her door. She'd been confined to quarters for 3 hours, long enough for the initial rage to fade and the weight of consequences to settle in. She'd crossed every line, violated every protocol. Her military career was almost certainly over, but strangely, she felt no regret. For the first time in 6 months, she'd been who she was meant to be, not who others expected her to be. The knock came at 1,847 hours. Commander Vance entered, her expression unreadable. She closed the door and leaned against it, studying Irene for a long moment. "That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen," Vance said finally. "Probably both, ma'am," Vance almost smiled. "NORAD confirmed your assessment. Those aircraft were conducting systematic reconnaissance, and they've been tracking them for days. When you engaged them electronically, it disrupted their operation and forced them to abort. The intelligence community is actually thrilled. The diplomatic corps, less so, but that's their problem." Irene felt something unclench in her chest. "So I was right." "Yes," which makes what happens next more complicated. Vance moved to the window, looking out at the flight line. "Colonel Hayes wants you court-martialed. He's calling it the worst breach of discipline he's seen in 30 years. Commander Grayson is more ambivalent. He recognizes you were right but can't openly support violation of orders." "And you, ma'am?" Vance turned, her expression intense. "I think you're exactly the kind of officer we need. Someone who sees patterns others miss, who has the courage to act when action is necessary, who refuses to accept limitations placed on them by people with smaller vision." She paused. "But I also think you're a pain in the ass who's going to make my life very difficult." "Yes, ma'am, I expect so. Here's what's going to happen. Tonight, there's a classified briefing at 2,100 hours. Selected officers only. They're going to review the intelligence data you compiled, the radar tracks from those unknown aircraft, and your tactical response. Colonel Hayes will be there. So will several admirals who are very interested in how a logistics lieutenant identified and neutralized a threat that our tactical officers missed." Irene's pulse quickened. "Am I invited to this briefing?" "Invited? No. Required? Yes." Vance moved toward the door, then paused. "By the way, Hayes has been asking about your call sign, Phantom Queen. He assumed it was something you made up today, some dramatic affectation. I didn't correct him, but ma'am, let him find out on his own. It'll be more educational that way. Vance opened the door. Get cleaned up, Hill, and try to look less like you just stole a fighter jet. More like the tactical genius who saved an international exercise. After Vance left, Irene showered and changed into a fresh uniform, her mind racing. The briefing could go either way. Hayes would push for punishment. Others might recognize the value of what she'd done. But, regardless of the outcome, one thing was certain. She'd force them to see her. Not as Logistics Martinez who filed reports, but as a pilot who could execute complex tactical operations under pressure. At 2045 hours, Irene walked across the base toward the secure briefing facility. The sun had set, and the base was quiet except for the distant sound of aircraft on the flight line. She passed other officers heading to the same briefing, their expressions curious when they recognized her. Inside the skiff, she found a seat near the back. The room filled quickly with an impressive array of rank. 2 admirals, several captains and commanders, Colonel Hayes, looking like he'd swallowed something poisonous, and Commander Grayson studying a folder with intense concentration. At exactly 2,100 hours, Admiral Richardson called the briefing to order. Gentlemen, ladies, we're here to review the events of today's exercise and address a situation that has implications for our operational, security, and command structure. His eyes found Irene. Lieutenant Hill, please take a seat at the table. Irene moved to the conference table, acutely aware of every eye in the room following her. She sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in front of her. Richardson activated a large display showing radar tracks and timeline data. At approximately 1,120 hours today, Lieutenant Hill identified 3 aircraft conducting what she assessed as hostile reconnaissance around our exercise area. Despite being a logistics officer with no tactical authority, she compiled intelligence data, determined hostile intent, and ultimately conducted an unauthorized flight to intercept and engage these aircraft. Colonel Hayes, you've called for her court-martial. Please state your case. Hayes stood, his jaw tight. Admiral, Lieutenant Hill's actions represent a complete breakdown of military discipline. Hayes's voice filled the briefing room with barely controlled anger. She violated direct orders, stole a military aircraft, and interfered with a multinational exercise. The fact that her assessment happened to be correct doesn't excuse the fundamental breach of discipline. If we allow officers to simply decide when orders apply to them, we undermine the entire command structure. He pulled up a slide showing the timeline of events. Hill was explicitly ordered to remain in her logistics role. She was not authorized to monitor tactical frequencies. She was certainly not authorized to launch an aircraft. Every action she took was in direct violation of established protocols. And yet, Admiral Richardson interjected, those violations resulted in the identification and disruption of a foreign intelligence operation that our tactical officers failed to detect. Commander Grayson, what's your assessment? Grayson stood, his weathered face thoughtful. Admiral, I'm conflicted. Lieutenant Hill's tactical judgment was sound. Her execution was flawless. But Colonel Hayes is right about the discipline issue. We can't have junior officers launching unauthorized missions based on their personal assessment of situations. Even when they're right, Richardson asked. Even then, sir. Because next time, they might be wrong, and someone might die. The Admiral turned his attention to Irene. Lieutenant Hill, you've heard the charges against you. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Irene stood, her heart hammering but her voice steady. Sir, I'm not going to claim I followed proper protocol. I didn't. I saw a developing threat that I believed would compromise our operations and potentially endanger our personnel. I made a judgment call that the immediate tactical necessity outweighed the requirement for proper authorization. That's not your judgment to make, Hayes interrupted. Perhaps not, sir, but someone had to make it, and nobody else was. Irene pulled out a tablet and connected it to the briefing room display. With permission, I'd like to show you what I saw before I launched. Richardson nodded. Proceed. Irene brought up her analysis, the work she'd compiled during those hours in the logistics center. These are the radar tracks of the 3 unknown aircraft. Notice the pattern. Systematic sweeps at precise intervals, altitude changes coordinated across all 3 aircraft, course corrections that maximize coverage while minimizing detection risk. This isn't recreational flying, it's professional reconnaissance. She advanced to the next slide. I compared these patterns against known intelligence gathering protocols from 12 different nations. The match was 93% consistent with Soviet-era doctrine, updated for modern technology. Whoever was flying those aircraft had been trained to collect intelligence on military operations. Hayes leaned forward. This is speculation. You're not an intelligence analyst. No, sir. I'm a pilot who studied intelligence gathering because I knew someday it might be relevant. Irene pulled up another slide showing communication intercepts. I also monitored their radio transmissions. They were using encrypted communications on frequencies typically reserved for military operations. The encryption itself told me these weren't civilian aircraft. Admiral Richardson studied the data with growing interest. How long have you been developing these analytical capabilities, Lieutenant? Since I arrived at Oceana, sir, I recognized that my assigned duties didn't fully utilize my training, so I expanded my knowledge base independently. By studying classified materials? Hayes demanded. By studying materials available through proper channels and applying analytical frameworks I developed through research. Irene met his gaze steadily. I didn't hack anything or access information I wasn't cleared for. I just paid attention to details that others overlooked. The second admiral, Peterson, spoke for the first time. Lieutenant, walk us through your tactical decision-making once you were airborne. Why did you engage the targets the way you did? Irene felt the shift in the room's energy. They weren't just prosecuting her anymore. They were evaluating her. Sir, I analyzed their formation and predicted their likely approach vectors. The first aircraft was the reconnaissance platform, gathering broad-spectrum data. I engaged it first to disrupt their primary collection effort. The second was providing electronic warfare support, jamming our communications. Taking it out restored our tactical network. The third was the command aircraft, coordinating the entire operation. She pulled up the engagement geometry. By positioning myself below radar coverage and using the ocean's clutter, I achieved surprise. My first 2 simulated shots were from positions they couldn't have anticipated. The third aircraft recognized the tactical situation had changed and withdrew before I could engage. Textbook prosecution, Peterson murmured, glancing at Hayes. Better than some operations I've seen from pilots with years of combat experience. Hayes's face reddened. Admiral, her tactical skill isn't the issue. The issue is discipline. Yes, Colonel, you've made that clear. Richardson stood, his presence commanding immediate silence. Here's what I see. I see a junior officer who identified a legitimate threat that our tactical staff missed, who demonstrated initiative and tactical acumen far beyond her rank and assigned duties, who successfully prosecuted a complex engagement against professionally trained adversaries. He paused. I also see an officer who violated direct orders and bypassed the chain of command. The room held its collective breath. Irene felt her career balanced on the Admiral's next words. Lieutenant Hill, your actions today were both commendable and unacceptable. The fact that you were right doesn't excuse the process. However, the fact that you were the only one who saw what was happening raises serious questions about how we're utilizing our personnel. Richardson looked at Hayes. Colonel, I'm denying your request for court-martial. Instead, Lieutenant Hill will receive a formal reprimand for unauthorized flight operations. Hayes's jaw dropped. Admiral, that's in addition, Richardson continued, his tone suggesting the matter was closed to debate. Lieutenant Hill is hereby reassigned to the Tactical Analysis Division, effective immediately. Her clearance will be upgraded, and she'll be given full access to intelligence databases. If she's going to be identifying threats, I want her doing it in a capacity where she can properly coordinate with tactical operations. Irene's mind reeled. Not court-martial, not discharge. A reprimand, yes, but also a promotion in everything but rank. Recognition that her skills had value beyond filing equipment manifests. Furthermore, Richardson added, looking directly at Irene, you'll be enrolled in the Top Gun program at the earliest available class. If you're going to be flying combat missions, you're going to be properly trained for them. The silence in the room was absolute. The briefing room remained frozen for 3 heartbeats. Then Colonel Hayes found his voice, tight with barely controlled fury. Admiral, with respect, Top Gun is reserved for our most elite pilots. Hill has logged minimal operational hours. She's completely unqualified for that level of training. She was unqualified to conduct the intercept she executed today, Admiral Peterson interjected. Yet she did it flawlessly. Perhaps our qualification standards need re-examination. Or perhaps we're setting her up for failure, Hayes shot back. Top Gun washout rate is 30%, and that's among pilots with years of experience. You send her there, she'll fail, and it'll be worse than if you'd court-martialed her today. Richardson's expression hardened. Are you suggesting she lacks the capability, Colonel? Because, from what I saw today, she demonstrated tactical awareness and execution that exceeds many pilots I've seen with combat ribbons. I'm suggesting that one successful engagement doesn't make her qualified for advanced fighter. Training. Hayes pulled up personnel records on the display. Look at her flight hours. She's logged barely 200 hours in tactical aircraft. Most Top Gun candidates have over 1,000. Most Top Gun candidates, Vance interjected quietly, haven't spent the last 6 months being systematically denied flight opportunities despite exceptional qualifications. Lieutenant Hill's low flight time reflects assignment decisions, not capability limitations. Hayes wheeled on Vance. Commander, are you seriously suggesting that I've been deliberately limiting Hill's opportunities? I'm suggesting that qualified pilots sometimes get overlooked for reasons that have nothing to do with their actual abilities. Vance's tone remained professional, but her meaning was clear. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Irene sat silent, watching her career and reputation being debated like a contested objective. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to argue that she deserved this opportunity. But another part recognized that speaking now would only undermine the support she was receiving. Admiral Richardson raised a hand, cutting off the brewing argument. This debate is pointless. The decision is made. Lieutenant Hill reports to Top Gun at the start of the next class cycle. Between now and then, she'll log operational hours with the Tactical Analysis Division and work with experienced pilots to build her proficiency. Commander Grayson, you'll ensure she has appropriate mentorship and resources. Grayson nodded, though his expression suggested reservations. Understood, Admiral. Though I should note that Top Gun instructors don't provide the kind of developmental support she might need. They're there to push elite pilots to their limits, not to build fundamental skills. Then she'll need to arrive with those fundamentals solidified. Richardson fixed Irene with an intense stare. Lieutenant, you've been given an extraordinary opportunity. The reprimand on your record will remain. It's a reminder that skill doesn't excuse bypassing proper channels. But you've also demonstrated capabilities that the Navy needs. Don't waste this chance. I won't, sir. Irene managed, her voice thick with emotion she fought to control. Dismissed, everyone except Lieutenant Hill. The room cleared slowly, officers filing out with backward glances at Irene. Hayes left last, his expression promising that this wasn't over. When the door closed, Richardson and Peterson moved to seats flanking Irene. Let's talk plainly, Richardson began. You've made enemies today. Hayes isn't the only one who thinks you're getting preferential treatment. Some will see this as the Navy bending rules for political optics. Others will assume you slept your way into opportunity. The bluntness stung, but Irene appreciated the honesty. I understand, sir. Do you? Peterson leaned forward. Because what you did today, stealing that aircraft, it was brilliant tactically, but catastrophic politically. We're protecting you now because your analysis was correct and your execution was flawless. But there won't be a third chance. You succeed at Top Gun, or you're done. What Admiral Peterson is saying, Richardson added more gently, is that you've burned your safety net. Every flight from now on will be scrutinized. Every decision questioned. You'll have to be twice as good as everyone else, just to be considered equal. Irene met their eyes steadily. I've been living with that standard since I joined the Navy, sir. It's nothing new. Richardson smiled slightly. Fair point. But now the stakes are higher. You're not just representing yourself anymore. Every woman who wants to fly combat missions, every junior officer who's been overlooked, they're all watching what happens to you. You succeed, you open doors. You fail, you slam them shut for a generation. The weight of those words settled on Irene's shoulders like physical pressure. She thought she was fighting for her own career, her own validation. Now she understood the battle was larger than her personal ambitions. There's something else you should know, Peterson said. That call sign you used today, Phantom Queen. We looked into it. Irene's pulse quickened. Here it comes, she thought. Care to explain how a logistics lieutenant has a call sign from classified operations conducted 3 years ago in the Black Sea? Peterson's tone was more curious than accusatory, but the question carried serious implications. Irene chose her words carefully. Sir, I participated in joint exercises with Romanian air forces during my time at the Naval Academy. There was an incident during night training operations where I assisted in locating a downed aircraft that search and rescue couldn't find. The Romanian pilots gave me the call sign. I didn't realize it had appeared in classified reports. It appeared, Richardson said, because that incident involved a covert operation that went sideways. The aircraft you helped locate was carrying intelligence assets. Your navigation skills and tactical awareness helped extract them before hostile forces arrived. The Romanians called you Phantom Queen because you appeared out of nowhere, solved an impossible problem, and disappeared back into administrative assignments before anyone could properly recognize your contribution. Peterson pulled up a file on his tablet. There's a classified commendation in here from Romanian intelligence services. They wanted to award you their equivalent of a medal. We declined because acknowledging the operation would compromise other activities. So you went back to filing reports and counting equipment, while the actual combat pilots took credit for missions you'd enabled. Irene felt something crack in her chest. She'd known her contribution to that operation had been significant, but she'd assumed it had been forgotten, dismissed as a minor support role. Learning that it had been recognized, documented, but then buried to maintain operational security brought 3 years of suppressed frustration flooding back. Why are you telling me this now? She asked quietly. Because Colonel Hayes is going to argue that you're an inexperienced pilot getting undeserved opportunities, Richardson replied. I want you to understand that your record, the real record that includes classified operations and unofficial contributions, shows a pattern. You consistently exceed expectations. You see solutions others miss. You execute under pressure with remarkable composure. The Navy failed you by not recognizing that earlier. We're trying to correct that failure now. He stood, signaling the meeting was ending. Report to Commander Vance tomorrow at 0800. She'll brief you on your new duties and training schedule. You have 4 months before Top Gun starts. Use them wisely. As Irene left the briefing facility, the night air felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She'd won the battle, but inherited a war. Every flight would be a test, every mission a trial. And somewhere out there, Colonel Hayes and others like him were already planning how to prove she didn't deserve this chance. But as she walked across the dark tarmac, passing the rows of aircraft that had been denied to her for so long, Irene Hill felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the naive hope of someone who believed merit alone would prevail, but the fierce hope of someone who'd learned to create opportunities when none were offered. The transition from logistics to tactical analysis happened with bureaucratic swiftness. By 0900 the next morning, Irene found herself in a secure facility she'd never been authorized to enter, surrounded by intelligence analysts and tactical officers who regarded her with mixtures of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed resentment. Her new workspace was a far cry from the converted hangar where she'd filed equipment reports. Multiple displays showed real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe. Encrypted communication channels carried classified traffic. The people working here dealt in threats and countermeasures, in patterns that determined whether operations succeeded or sailors died. Commander Vance introduced her to the team lead, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kovac, a no-nonsense analyst who'd spent 15 years tracking foreign military capabilities. Kovac studied Irene with the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen too many hotshot pilots think intelligence work was beneath them. Lieutenant Hill, Kovac began, her Eastern European accent slight but detectable. Commander Vance tells me you have analytical instincts. I'm less interested in instincts than I am in methodology. Intelligence? Work isn't about dramatic gestures. It's about patient analysis and rigorous verification. Can you handle that? Yes, ma'am, Irene replied, recognizing the challenge in the question. Kovac was testing whether she was just an adrenaline junkie who'd gotten lucky, or someone who could actually contribute to systematic intelligence operations. We'll see. Kovac gestured to a workstation. Your first assignment? Review the complete intelligence package on yesterday's incident. I want a formal analysis including threat assessment, tactical recommendations, and lessons learned, due by end of business today. Irene spent the next 8 hours immersed in data. Radar tracks, communication intercepts, satellite imagery, and intelligence reports from multiple agencies. The unknown aircraft from yesterday's incident had been tracked for weeks, their pattern of reconnaissance gradually escalating. What Irene had interrupted was apparently the culmination of a long-term intelligence gathering operation. As she worked, she became aware of the office dynamics around her. Several analysts were clearly veterans of the intelligence community, career officers who'd chosen analysis over operational roles. Others were former pilots who transitioned to intelligence after injuries or when their combat days ended. None of them seemed thrilled about having a junior officer with minimal experience suddenly thrust into their ranks. During lunch, which she ate at her desk, Lieutenant Marcus Rivera approached. A former F-18 pilot who'd lost partial vision in one eye during a training accident, Rivera now specialized in aerial threat assessment. So you're the one who stole a Hornet and played hero? He said, his tone carefully neutral. I'm the one who responded to a developing situation, Irene replied, not looking up from her analysis. Right. And now you're here, getting preferential assignments and fast-tracked to Top Gun while the rest of us grind through normal career progression. Rivera leaned against her desk. Word of advice. This team doesn't care about your dramatic flying skills. We care about accurate analysis that keeps people alive. If you can't deliver that, you'll wash out faster than you climb that rank ladder. Irene finally looked up, meeting his gaze. I'm not here because I think I'm special. I'm here because I identified a threat that the normal process missed. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps the question is why the normal process failed. Rivera's expression flickered between irritation and grudging respect. Fair enough, but don't expect everyone to be impressed by your unauthorized heroics. Half the people in this office could have flown that intercept. The difference is we follow orders. After he walked away, Irene returned to her analysis, but his words lingered. He was right, in a way. Her tactical skills weren't unique. What had set her apart was her willingness to act when others waited for permission. But in the intelligence world, acting without proper authorization could get people killed. She submitted her analysis at 1,647 hours. Kovach reviewed it immediately, her expression unreadable as she scrolled through Irene's detailed breakdown of the incident. Finally, she looked up. This is good work. Thorough, well-reasoned, properly sourced. Kovach paused. But you missed something critical. Review Section 3 of the Signals Intelligence and tell me what you don't see. Irene pulled up the SIGINT data, scanning through communication intercepts and electronic signatures. She reviewed it once, twice, 3 times before the absence hit her. There's no command and control traffic. The aircraft were operating autonomously. Exactly. Which suggests what? That they were either running pre-programmed routes or they were receiving orders through a channel we didn't intercept. Probably the latter, which means there's a communication method we haven't identified. Kovach nodded approvingly. That's the kind of second-level analysis we need. The obvious threats are easy to spot. The gaps in our understanding are what kill people. Good work, Hill. Tomorrow, you'll start on current threat assessments. And you'll begin flying again operational sorties with experienced pilots who'll evaluate your capabilities honestly. The next 3 months became a blur of intense activity. Irene split her time between intelligence analysis and flight operations, often working 16-hour days. In the mornings, she briefed tactical teams on threat assessments. In the afternoons, she flew training missions with pilots who tested her limits relentlessly. Lieutenant Commander Brennan, who'd mocked her in the logistics office, became one of her flight instructors. His approach was professional but demanding, pushing her through scenarios that exposed every weakness in her limited operational experience. You fly like someone who learned in a simulator, he told her after one particularly challenging session. Technically perfect but lacking operational intuition. You need to stop calculating and start feeling the aircraft. Irene bristled at the criticism but recognized its validity. She'd spent so much time compensating for lack of flight hours with intellectual preparation that she developed an overly analytical approach. Combat flying required instinct as much as analysis. She started flying more aggressively, taking risks in training that made her instructors nervous but developed the kind of operational confidence she'd been lacking. She learned to trust her instincts, to react without overthinking, to embrace the chaos of combat maneuvering. Meanwhile, her intelligence work earned grudging respect from the analytical team. She developed a knack for identifying patterns in adversary behavior, for seeing connections that others missed. Kovach began assigning her increasingly complex assessments, trusting her judgment on matters that affected operational planning. But the shadow of Top Gun loomed larger as the start date approached. The Navy's fighter weapons school wasn't just advanced training. It was a crucible designed to break pilots who didn't have what it took to survive combat. The washout rate was 30%, and most of those were experienced pilots with years of operational flying. 2 weeks before she was scheduled to report, Irene received unexpected orders to brief Admiral Richardson on emerging threats in the Black Sea region. She spent 3 days preparing, analyzing Russian and Romanian naval activities, identifying potential flashpoints. The briefing took place in a secure conference room with Richardson and several other flag officers present. Irene presented her analysis with confidence built from months of intelligence work, highlighting 3 areas of concern and recommending specific countermeasures. When she finished, Richardson studied her for a long moment. "Lieutenant, you've come a long way in 3 months. Commander Vance tells me you're ready for Top Gun. Are you?" Irene thought about the question seriously. Was she ready? By traditional metrics, barely. She still had fewer flight hours than most candidates. But she'd spent 3 months doing nothing but flying, analyzing, and preparing. "Sir, I'm as ready as I can be given the time available. I know I'll be behind other students in experience. But I learn fast, and I don't quit." That's what I needed to hear. Richardson stood, signaling the briefing was over. Good luck, Lieutenant. The Navy's watching what happens next. The drive to Naval Air Station Fallon took Irene through Nevada desert that stretched endlessly under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Top Gun had relocated here years ago, away from the crowded airspace of San Diego, to a facility where pilots could train without restrictions. The isolation was intentional. Students needed to focus entirely on becoming weapons, not on distractions. Irene arrived on a Sunday evening, checking into the bachelor officer's quarters that would be her home for the next 13 weeks. The building was quiet, most students not arriving until the next morning. She unpacked methodically, arranging her gear with the precision that had become habit. On her desk, she placed a photo of her parents taken at her Naval Academy graduation. Her mother's Romanian pride and her father's Italian intensity both visible in their expressions. "Your Hill?" A voice came from the doorway. A tall pilot with close-cropped hair and confident bearing leaned against the frame. "I'm Hawk. Guess we're classmates. Word is, you're the logistics officer who went rogue and somehow ended up here." "Word travels," Irene replied, continuing her unpacking. "In naval aviation?" "Always." Hawk entered the room uninvited, his swagger suggesting years of earned confidence. "Look, I don't know your story and don't care, but you should know that half the class thinks you're a diversity pick who'll wash out in week 2. The other half thinks you're some kind of prodigy. Either way, everyone's watching. Then they'll see what they see," Irene said simply. Hawk laughed. "Fair enough. Breakfast briefing is at 0530. Don't be late. They'll make an example of you." After he left, Irene sat on her bunk and allowed herself a moment of doubt. She was about to compete against pilots who'd been flying combat missions while she'd been filing equipment reports. They had experience she couldn't match, instincts developed through hundreds of hours of operational flying. What made her think she belonged here? The answer came as it always did, because she'd earned this chance through skill, determination, and refusing to accept the limitations others placed on her. She wasn't here to prove she was as good as them. She was here to prove she was better. Monday morning arrived with Nevada heat already building at 0500. Irene joined 32 other pilots in the briefing room, recognizing several from reputation. These were the best fighter pilots in the Navy, selected from squadrons across the fleet. Every one of them had combat experience or exceptional training records. Every one of them was here to become even more lethal. The Commandant, Captain Michael Judge Harrison, addressed them with the gravitas of someone who'd survived 3 combat deployments and trained hundreds of pilots. "Welcome to the Navy Fighter Weapons School. You're here because you're good. By the time you leave, you'll be exceptional or you'll be gone. We don't give participation trophies. We produce weapons instructors who keep other pilots alive in combat." He outlined the curriculum: air combat maneuvering, tactical intercepts, strike warfare, threat reaction, and lectures covering everything from adversary capabilities to weapons employment. The pace would be relentless, the standards unforgiving. "Look at the person next to you," Harrison commanded. Everyone complied. "Statistically, one of you 3 won't be here at graduation. The question you should be asking is, will it be me?" The first week was baptism by fire. Morning flights pushed students through increasingly complex air combat scenarios. Afternoons featured academics covering threat systems, tactics, and weapons capabilities. Evenings were spent reviewing gun camera footage, analyzing mistakes, and preparing for the next day's missions. Irene struggled initially with the air combat maneuvering. Her simulator experience had prepared her for technical flying, but ACM required aggressive instincts she'd never fully developed. During debriefs, instructors were brutally honest about her deficiencies. "Hill, you're defensive when you should be offensive," her instructor Viper noted after one particularly poor performance. "You fly like someone afraid to make mistakes. In combat, hesitation kills. You need to be more aggressive." She took the criticism to heart, but changing flying style proved difficult. Years of being told she was too small, too inexperienced, too risky had instilled caution she didn't realize she carried. Breaking through that psychological barrier became her primary challenge. The breakthrough came during week 3. Irene was flying against Hawk in a 1-versus-1 scenario. He'd beaten her twice already, his aggressive flying overwhelming her defensive tactics. On the third engagement, something shifted. Instead of reacting to his moves, she anticipated them, using her analytical skills to predict his next maneuver. When he committed to an attack, she reversed hard, pulling her Hornet through a maneuver that pushed the edge of the aircraft's capability. For 3 seconds, she sustained G-forces that made her vision tunnel. But when she emerged, Hawk was in front of her, vulnerable. Fox 2, she called, simulating a missile shot that would have killed him in real combat. The debrief was different this time. Viper actually smiled. Now that's what I'm looking for. You saw the opportunity and took it. That killer instinct, that's what separates good pilots from great ones. Hawk was less pleased but respectful. Nice flying, Hill. You set me up perfectly. Didn't see it coming. From that point forward, Irene's confidence grew. She started flying more aggressively, trusting her instincts while still leveraging her analytical capabilities. Her scores improved steadily, her performance moving from the bottom third of the class to the middle, then higher. But just as she found her rhythm, Colonel Hayes arrived at Fallon for what was officially described as a routine visit, but everyone knew was about her. She saw him talking with Captain Harrison, saw them reviewing her performance records, saw the doubt in Harrison's expression afterward. That evening, Harrison called her to his office. "Lieutenant, we need to discuss your progress. Colonel Hayes has raised concerns about your readiness for this program. He believes you were admitted prematurely and suggests that continuing might set you up for public failure." Irene's hands clenched. "Sir, my performance has improved significantly. I'm meeting standards and continuing to develop." Meeting standards isn't the same as exceeding them. Hayes argues that you're consuming instructor time and resources that could be better spent on pilots with higher potential. Harrison paused. He's recommended you be removed from the program. The words hit like physical blows. After everything she'd overcome, after proving herself repeatedly, Hayes was still trying to force her out. "What do you think, sir?" Harrison studied her for a long moment. "I think you've shown remarkable improvement. I also think Hayes has a point about your limited experience. What I don't know is whether you have the capacity to not just complete this program, but to excel in it. Top Gun doesn't produce average pilots. Give me 2 more weeks, sir. If I'm not in the top half of the class by then, I'll withdraw voluntarily. 2 weeks. But he'll understand that I'll be watching every flight, every brief, every performance metric. If Hayes is right and you're not ready, I won't let you fail publicly. I'll cut you before that happens." Irene left his office knowing she'd just wagered her entire career on 2 weeks of flying. Everything came down to this. Prove she belonged at the highest level of naval aviation, or accept that maybe everyone who doubted her had been right all along. The next 2 weeks became the most intense period of Irene's life. She flew twice daily, pushing herself and her aircraft to absolute limits. Every engagement was recorded, analyzed, and critiqued in excruciating detail. Every mistake was magnified, every success measured against the performance of pilots with years more experience. She started waking at 0400 to review threat data before flights, staying up past midnight studying gun camera footage and adversary tactics. Sleep became a luxury measured in hours rather than full nights. Her body ached from sustained G-forces, her mind constantly processing aerial geometry and weapons employment parameters. But something remarkable happened. The more she flew, the more natural it became. The analytical approach that had initially limited her aggression evolved into predictive capability that gave her an edge. She could see patterns in opponents flying that let her anticipate their moves 3 steps ahead. During a complex 4 versus 4 scenario in Week 12, Irene commanded a strike package against determined opposition. Her tactical decisions were crisp and decisive, her communication clear, her execution flawless. When the exercise concluded, her element had achieved all objectives with 0 losses while eliminating 6 enemy aircraft. The debrief that followed was subdued, instructors exchanging glances that suggested they were witnessing something unexpected. Viper spoke first. Hill, that was graduate level tactical. Employment. You positioned your flight perfectly, exploited every enemy mistake, and adapted when the situation changed. That's exactly what we want to see from a Top Gun graduate. Captain Harrison attended that debrief, his expression thoughtful as he reviewed the footage. After it concluded, he approached Irene. My office. 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt eternal. Irene changed out of her sweat-soaked flight suit, trying to read meaning into Harrison's tone. Was this the moment he told her she'd proven herself, or that she still wasn't good enough? In his office, Harrison gestured for her to sit. On his desk were performance rankings for the entire class. Irene could see her name, but couldn't read her position from her angle. Lieutenant Hill, when you arrived here, you were statistically the least experienced pilot in your class. Your flight hours were 60% below the median. Several instructors, myself included, questioned whether you could compete at this level. He turned the rankings so she could see them clearly. You're currently ranked 7th out of 33 students. Top quartile. Your improvement curve is the steepest we've seen in years. Irene felt something release in her chest, emotion threatening to overwhelm her composure. 7th. Not just passing, but excelling. Colonel Hayes is arriving tomorrow for final evaluations, Harrison continued. He still believes you don't belong here. He's going to recommend against your graduation, arguing that your performance, while improved, doesn't justify the accommodation you received. Accommodation, sir? He claims you were admitted under reduced standards due to political pressure, that every other student had to earn their slot through conventional means, while you took a shortcut. Harrison's expression suggested his opinion of that argument. Tomorrow's evaluation will be comprehensive. You'll fly against our most experienced adversary instructors in scenarios designed to expose any weaknesses. Hayes will be watching every moment. What's the scenario, sir? Unknown until you're in the air. Could be air superiority, strike, escort, defensive counter-air, anything. You'll lead a 2-ship element against multiple adversaries with superior numbers and positioning. It's designed to be nearly impossible. Harrison paused, which is exactly what Hayes wants. He's expecting you to fail under pressure, to prove his point that you're not ready. Irene met his gaze steadily. Then I'll have to disappoint him, sir. You're confident? I'm prepared. There's a difference, but I'll take prepared over confident any day. Harrison almost smiled, dismissed. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to define your career one way or another. That night, Irene lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling, replaying every lesson learned over 3 months of intensive training. She thought about her journey from logistics officer to fighter pilot, about every obstacle overcome and every person who doubted her. She thought about Jessica Martinez from that inspirational story, about how sometimes proving yourself meant taking risks others wouldn't take. But this was different. Tomorrow, she wouldn't be stealing an aircraft or violating orders. She'd be competing on terms set by the institution, proving herself through the very system that had tried to exclude her. That was the ultimate victory, not working around the system, but forcing it to recognize her on its own terms. At 0500, Irene rose, dressed, and prepared for the evaluation that would determine everything. In the mirror, she saw not the overlooked logistics officer from 6 months ago, but a fighter pilot who'd earned her place through skill, determination, and refusing to accept limitations others placed on her. Colonel Hayes wanted her to fail. Captain Harrison needed her to succeed. But what Irene wanted was simpler, to fly like the pilot she'd always known she could be. and let the results speak for themselves. The evaluation would begin in 2 hours. By the time it ended, everyone would know whether Phantom Queen was a call sign she'd truly earned or just a dramatic name attached to a lucky engagement. Irene Hill was ready to show them the answer. The briefing room at 0700 was packed with instructors, students, and, seated prominently in the front row, Colonel Hayes. His expression radiated skepticism as Irene entered with her wingman, Lieutenant Torch Matthews, one of the top-performing students who'd volunteered to fly with her. Captain Harrison outlined this scenario with clinical precision. 2-ship strike package. Primary mission is to penetrate defended airspace and destroy a high-value target. You'll face a minimum of 6 adversary aircraft with superior positioning. Electronic warfare will degrade your sensors. Weather is marginal. Success requires flawless execution and tactical creativity. Hayes leaned forward. And if they fail, Captain, then they fail. Like any other students who can't meet standards. Harrison's tone suggested he didn't appreciate the implication. 30 minutes later, Irene strapped into her FA-18, running through pre-flight checks with the calm focus that had become second nature. Torch's aircraft sat beside hers, his thumbs up visible through the canopy. They'd briefed their tactics thoroughly, developed contingency plans, and established communication protocols. Strike package. You're cleared for departure, the tower announced. The takeoff was smooth, 2 aircraft lifting into Nevada sky that promised another scorching day. As they climbed to altitude, Irene reviewed the mission parameters one final time. 6 adversaries, defended target, degraded sensors. Everything designed to overwhelm a 2-ship element. Torch, picture check, she called, requesting tactical information. 2 groups, Bullseye 270 at 40, high aspect. Second group, Bullseye 330 at 50, flanking. Torch's voice was calm, professional. He was feeding her the tactical picture, trusting her to command. Irene processed the information instantly. The adversaries had positioned themselves to force her into a predictable defensive reaction. Standard doctrine would have her element turning away, trying to avoid engagement. But standard doctrine assumed limited offensive capability. Torch, we're going offensive. Target the northern group, I'll handle the southern element. Make them react to us instead of executing their plan. Copy, engaged northern group. What happened next would be analyzed in debrief rooms for years. Irene didn't avoid the adversaries. She flew directly at the southern element, forcing them to react to her aggressive approach. When they committed to an intercept, she used their predictable response to maneuver into an advantageous position. Fox 3. She simulated a long-range missile shot that would have destroyed the lead adversary aircraft. The remaining aircraft broke. Formation, their coordinated attack disrupted by her unexpected aggression. Meanwhile, Torch engaged the northern group with similar success. Within 90 seconds, they neutralized 4 of the 6 adversaries through combination of accurate, simulated weapons employment and superior tactical positioning. The remaining 2 adversaries recognized they'd lost advantage and withdrew to regroup. Irene used the brief respite to reassess the tactical situation and coordinate with Torch for the strike run. Target area in 60 seconds, expecting surface-to-air threats. The simulated SAM systems activated as predicted, their radar signatures lighting up Irene's threat warning system. She employed countermeasures while simultaneously maintaining awareness of remaining airborne threats. The mental workload was enormous, requiring her to process multiple threats while flying precisely enough to deliver simulated weapons on target. Rifle, she called, indicating simulated missile launch against the ground target. Simultaneously, she maneuvered to avoid simulated SAM fire, pulling her aircraft through a series of defensive maneuvers that pushed the edge of the flight envelope. Target destroyed, the controller announced. Strike package, successful mission. Return to base. The landing was anticlimactic after the intensity of the mission. But Irene's hands were shaking slightly as she climbed out of the cockpit. She'd done it. Against superior numbers, with the greatest systems, in challenging conditions, she completed the mission flawlessly. The debrief room was silent as Harrison reviewed the footage. Every moment of the engagement was displayed in detail, showing Irene's tactical decisions and their outcomes. When the review concluded, he turned to the assembled audience. That was a graduate-level performance. Lieutenant Hill demonstrated tactical awareness, aggressive decision-making, and precise execution under pressure. She didn't just complete the mission, she dominated it. Harrison looked directly at Hayes. "Colonel, do you still question whether she belongs in this program?" Hayes' face was carefully neutral, but Irene could see the calculation behind his eyes. He'd wanted her to fail, expected her to fail, but she'd succeeded so decisively that arguing against her would make him look petty rather than principled. "The performance was adequate," Hayes said finally, his tone suggesting those words tasted bitter. "Though I maintain that special accommodations set concerning precedence." "Lieutenant Hill received no special accommodations in this evaluation," Harrison replied sharply. "She faced the same scenario we use for all final assessments. Her success was earned through skill and preparation, nothing more." Admiral Richardson, who'd arrived unannounced to observe, stood from his position in the back of the room. "Colonel Hayes, I understand your concerns about maintaining standards, but what I've witnessed today confirms what I suspected 6 months ago. We've been underutilizing exceptional talent because it comes in unexpected packages. Lieutenant Hill has proven she belongs here. The question now is how we ensure we don't miss the next pilot like her." Hayes stood, his expression tight. "With respect, Admiral, I disagree with that assessment, but I recognize that I'm outvoted." He looked at Irene, and for just a moment, something other than contempt flickered in his eyes. Perhaps grudging respect, perhaps just acknowledgement that he'd lost this battle. "Congratulations, Lieutenant, you've proven me wrong. I don't admit that often." He left the briefing room, his departure feeling like the end of more than just this evaluation. Irene had proven herself not just to Hayes, but to every person who doubted whether she deserved opportunities she'd fought for. Captain Harrison approached as others filed out. "Lieutenant Hill, you'll graduate with your class in 2 weeks. After that, you're assigned as a Top Gun instructor. We need people who can teach the kind of tactical thinking you demonstrated today." "Instructor, sir?" Irene's surprise was genuine. "I just graduated. Don't instructors typically have years of operational experience?" "Typically, yes, but you're not a typical case. You see patterns others miss, you think creatively under pressure, and most importantly, you've overcome obstacles that make you uniquely qualified to mentor other pilots who don't fit conventional molds." Harrison smiled slightly. "Besides, having Phantom Queen as an instructor sends a message about the kind of excellence we're looking for." 2 weeks later, Irene stood on the flight line in her dress whites as Captain Harrison pinned the Top Gun graduate patch on her uniform. Her parents had flown in from Europe, their pride visible in every photograph. Commander Vance attended, as did several pilots from Oceania who'd watched her journey from logistics officer to fighter weapons instructor. But the moment that mattered most came after the ceremony, when a young female ensign approached nervously. "Lieutenant Hill, I'm starting flight training next month. When I heard your story about how you were told you weren't good enough but proved them wrong, it made me think maybe I could do this too." Irene looked at the ensign's hopeful expression and saw herself 6 months ago, full of determination, but facing systems designed to limit rather than nurture her potential. "You can absolutely do this. But remember, proving them wrong isn't enough. You have to be so undeniably excellent that they have no choice but to recognize you. It's not fair that you'll be judged more harshly than others, but that's the reality. Use it as motivation." As the ensign walked away, Irene reflected on her journey. From overlooked logistics officer to Top Gun instructor, from filing equipment reports to teaching combat tactics. From being called too small, too inexperienced, too emotional, to earning a call sign that made colonels drop coffee cups when they learned its true origin. The sun was setting over Fallon as Irene walked back to her quarters, her instructor patch catching the fading light. Tomorrow, she began teaching the next generation of fighter pilots, passing on lessons learned through months of struggle and triumph. Colonel Hayes had asked mockingly for her call sign, expecting something diminutive or cute. When she'd answered Phantom Queen, his coffee cup had indeed slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. Because what he hadn't known, what none of them had known, was that Phantom Queen wasn't a name she'd chosen. It was recognition she'd earned through actions that saved lives and advanced operations in ways that could never be fully acknowledged. Now that call sign would be passed forward, a reminder that excellence comes in unexpected forms, that limitations are often imposed rather than inherent, and that sometimes the best way to change a system is to force it to recognize you on your own terms. Lieutenant Irene Hill, call sign Phantom Queen, was ready to teach that lesson to anyone willing to learn. Final CTA. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.